the birth of the twins Rebekah, Isaac's beloved wife, was going through a challenging time in her life. Although the love between them was strong, time passed, and she was unable to have children. Isaac, knowing of God's promise to Abraham that his descendants would be numerous, earnestly interceded with the Lord on behalf of his wife. God's answer came in a powerful way, and Rebekah finally conceived. However, something unusual began to happen. Rebekah felt intense movements in her belly, as if a battle was going on inside her. It was more than just agitation, it was as if a struggle was unfolding even before the children were born. Worried, she sought the Lord in prayer, asking for understanding about what was happening. God, in his infinite wisdom, answered. 2 nations are in her womb, 2 peoples, who will be separated from their wombs. 1 people will be stronger than another, and the older will serve the younger. This revelation not only shed light on the movements within Rebekah, but it also brought prophetic insight into the future of her children and the impact they would have on the course of history. Then came the long-awaited day of the birth. Rebekah gave birth to Esau first. He was unlike anything they had ever seen, his skin was reddish and covered with hair. So they gave him the name Esau, which means hairy. Soon after, the second child was born. He emerged holding his older brother's heel, as if he was already determined not to be left behind. This striking detail earned him the name Jacob, which means, one who grabs by the heel, or supplanter. The scene was impressive and loaded with meaning. The prophecy began to be fulfilled from birth. Esau, robust and full of energy, represented brute strength, while Jacob, even as the youngest, already demonstrated determination and intelligence, holding firmly to his brother. This story, from the beginning, points to God's sovereign plans, which often defy human expectations. Even in the womb, the 2 brothers were already destined for a journey of rivalry and promise, marked by twists and turns that would shape the future of entire nations. The distinct personalities as the twins Esau and Jacob grew older, their personalities began to stand out in a marked way, almost as if they were 2 polar opposites. Esau was a man of action, vigorous and fearless. He loved exploring the surrounding fields and forests, where he felt most alive. He became a skilled hunter, known for his ability to dexterously slaughter animals and provide fresh meat for his family. Esau exuded a wild energy, with his robust body and striking appearance, covered in hair. He was someone who preferred the outdoors, away from homely responsibilities. Jacob, on the other hand, was the complete opposite. From a young age, he demonstrated a quiet and reserved personality. While Esau ran through the fields with a bow and arrow, Jacob remained near the tents, taking care of household chores and learning how to deal with the flocks. He had an observant and calculating spirit, someone who seemed to weigh every word and decision. Jacob was the one who valued stillness, strategy, and closer relationships. But the differences between the brothers were not only noticed by those around them. Within the family itself, these very distinct personalities influenced the hearts of the parents in an evident way. Isaac, admiring Esau's strength and skill as a hunter, developed a special affection for him. Perhaps Isaac, growing old, saw in Esau a representation of the vitality that he himself felt slipping away. In addition, Esau often prepared delicious food with the game he brought, which also won his father's heart. On the other hand, Rebekah had a unique connection with Jacob. Perhaps she saw in him not only the calmness and cunning, but also the divine promise that God had revealed to her even before the birth of her children, that the older would serve the younger. Rebekah was shrewd and seemed to understand that Jacob had a special role in God's plans. This connection made her nurture a particular affection for him, dedicating closer attention to him. This division in affections within the family, although common by the standards of the time, began to draw lines of tension between the brothers. Esau, beloved by Isaac, and Jacob, preferred by Rebekah, were on opposite paths not only in personality but also in family dynamics. The seed of a future conflict was already planted. It was as if the fate of the 2 brothers was already being written, each assuming their role in a story that would continue to shape generations. And although Esau and Jacob were different as day and night, they both carried within them the divine promise that would change the course of their lives in unexpected ways. The sale of the birthright. It was a typical day in the life of the brothers, but the heat of the sun seemed more intense than usual. Esau had spent hours in the field, chasing animals to hunt. His body was exhausted, his muscles heavy and hunger almost unbearable. He returned home with slow and tired steps, feeling consumed by the wear and tear of the journey. As he approached the tents, Esau was immediately enveloped by an irresistible aroma. Jacob, who preferred the comforts of home, stood by a small fire, stirring carefully in a steaming stew. The smell was rich and tempting, a mixture of spices and herbs that seemed to be the solution to Esau's hunger. Without hesitation, Esau approached Jacob, practically collapsing next to his brother. "Please, give me some of that red stew. I'm hungry, almost dying." Jacob, who always thought before acting, raised his eyes and saw a unique opportunity. He knew that Esau was impulsive, driven by immediate needs, and he decided to make a proposal. "I'll give you this stew, but in return I want something of value. I want your birthright." Primogeniture, in that culture, was extremely important. The eldest son received a special blessing, inherited most of the family's assets and, most importantly, the role of spiritual leader among the brothers. But Esau, completely overcome with hunger, did not even ponder the meaning of this exchange. "What good is the birthright if I die of hunger?" Esau replied contemptuously for the matter. For him, at that moment, a plate of food was worth more than any future promise. Jacob, shrewd, insisted. "Swear to me now." Esau, without thinking twice, took the oath. With that, he gave Jacob something that should have been his by birthright. Jacob was pleased and served him the stew with bread. Esau ate quickly, not appreciating the weight of his decision. The exchange seemed simple and even insignificant to Esau, but it marked a pivotal point in the story of the two brothers. Esau had despised something sacred, while Jacob, moved by his cunning and sense of purpose, began to tread a path that would lead him to fulfill the divine promise. The smell of the stew dissipated in the air, but the impact of that meal would remain forever. Esau, satisfied in body, little did he know that he had renounced a spiritual and historical legacy. And Jacob, even with his questionable intentions, was one step closer to the destiny that God had already mapped out for him. The stolen blessing time had passed, and Isaac, now in his old age, felt the weight of the years. His eyesight was very dim, almost non-existent, and he knew that his time to leave was near. In his mind, the desire to bless Esau, his firstborn son, was urgent. This blessing was more than words, it was the spiritual confirmation of leadership and prosperity, a gesture that would determine the future of the heir to the family. One afternoon, Isaac called Esau privately. "My son," he said in a weakened voice. "I'm old and I don't know the day of my death. Grab your guns, your bow and arrows, and go out into the field to hunt something for me. Prepare a tasty meal, as I like, and after that I will give you my blessing." Esau, proud of his skill as a hunter, set out immediately, eager to fulfill his father's request. Meanwhile, Rebekah, who had overheard the conversation, began to plan something different. From the birth of the twins, she knew God's promise: the older would serve the younger. And now, seeing the opportunity before his eyes, he decided to act. Rebekah hastily called Jacob and shared the plan. "Your father will bless Esau, but we need to make sure the blessing is yours, as God said. Go get 2 of the best kids in the herd. I will prepare them as your father likes, and you will bring the food to him, pretending to be Esau." Jacob hesitated. "But Mom, Esau is hairy, and I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? He will realize that I am deceiving and, instead of blessing, I will receive a curse." Rebekah answered firmly. "May this curse fall upon me, my son. Just do what I'm saying." Reluctantly, Jacob obeyed. He brought the goats, and Rebekah skillfully prepared the meal, seasoning it just as Isaac liked. Then she took Esau's best clothes, which were in the house, and clothed Jacob with them. To complete the disguise, she covered his hands and neck with the skins of the goats, creating the rough sensation of hair characteristic of Esau. Jacob, carrying the food and his heart full of nervousness, entered Isaac's room. "My father," he said, trying to imitate Esau's voice. "Here I am, who are you, my son?" Isaac asked, suspiciously. Jacob answered firmly, but not without guilt. "I am Esau, your firstborn. I did what you asked. Please sit down and eat the game, that you may bless me." Isaac hesitated. Something seemed strange. "How did you find the game so quickly, my son?" Jacob answered with a lie. "The Lord your God has put you in my way." Still suspicious, Isaac asked, "Come closer so that I can touch you, my son, and see if you are really Esau." Jacob came near, and Isaac touched his hands covered with the skins of the goats. "The voice is Jacob's, but the hands are Esau's," he said, confused. Still, Isaac accepted the disguise. After eating the meal prepared by Rebekah, Isaac asked Jacob to come over to receive the blessing. He laid his hands on his son and spoke powerful words, wishing him plenty, dominion over nations, and leadership over his brothers. The blessing that should have been Esau's now belonged to Jacob. Shortly after, Jacob hurried out, and it was not long before Esau arrived with his game ready. When Isaac realized the deception, he shuddered violently. "Who brought me the game before? I have already given the blessing, and it will remain upon him." Esau cried out in despair. "My father, bless me too." But Isaac, though distressed, explained that there was nothing more to do. Esau wept bitterly, and from that day on, he held a grudge against Jacob, vowing that one day he would avenge what he had lost. Meanwhile, Jacob began to reap the consequences of his actions, carrying with him both the blessing and the weight of deception. From that moment on, his life would take an unexpected and challenging turn, shaped by God's promises and human mistakes. Esau's wrath. The news fell on Esau like lightning on a stormy day. Upon returning from the field, with his game prepared and his heart eager to receive his father's blessing, he found Isaac shaken, his eyes fixed on nothingness, trying to process what had happened. "Who are you?" Isaac asked, his voice trembling and full of uncertainty. "It is I, Esau, your firstborn. I brought the food so that you can bless me," Esau replied, not understanding the situation. Isaac's next words fell like a stone on his chest. "Your brother came by deceit and took the blessing that was his." Pain and indignation exploded in Esau. He cried out in despair, "Father, is there no blessing for me?" Isaac, with regret, explained that he had already given everything to Jacob: leadership, the abundance of the land, dominion over his brothers. Esau wept bitterly, like a man wounded in the heart. "Father, please. Bless me too." Isaac did what he could, but the words addressed to Esau were harsh. He would be Jacob's servant and live in arid lands. Esau left the room overcome with a deep rage, feeling betrayed, not only by his brother, but also by the fate that seemed to have conspired against him. Esau's anger grew like a storm. The heat of his anger turned into a burning desire for revenge. In his heart, he planned, "When my father dies, I will kill Jacob." The idea of eliminating his brother was like a fire that could not be put out. He could not forget Jacob's face or Isaac's words. Rebekah, however, was attentive and knew how to read the signs. She sensed the fury in Esau's eyes and heard his somber murmurs. Her mother's heart went into alert. While he knew that Jacob had acted deceitfully, he also understood that Esau was willing to commit a terrible act. Wisely, Rebekah called Jacob in secret. "My son, Esau is furious and plans to kill you as soon as your father leaves. You need to run away, and fast. Go to my brother Laban's house in Haran. Stay there until your brother's wrath passes, until he forgets what happened." Jacob, though fearful, knew that his mother was right. He didn't want to abandon his family, but he understood that his life was at risk. Before leaving, Rebekah went to Isaac and suggested that Jacob be sent to Haran in search of a wife, away from the Canaanite women who worried the couple so much. Isaac, agreeing, blessed Jacob once more and sent him on his journey. As Jacob departed, Rebekah's heart was divided. She knew she was protecting her son, but she was also aware that her actions had sown pain among the siblings. Esau, for his part, remained consumed with anger, swearing that the reckoning with Jacob was only a matter of time. this was just the tip of the iceberg of a story that would unfold in paths full of surprises, reconciliations and, above all, divine providence. But at that moment, Jacob's future seemed uncertain, and Esau's wrath was like a threatening shadow over his life. Jacob's flight. Jacob leaves for Haran, and on the way he has a dream at Bethel. He sees a ladder that connects earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending. God reaffirms his promise to bless you and multiply your offspring. The night was dark, and the only sound Jacob heard was that of his own footsteps as he walked along the lonely path toward Haran. Fear and uncertainty accompanied him like shadows. He was on the run, leaving behind his parents' house, his mother's love, and Esau's relentless wrath. The path seemed endless, and the weight of guilt and the unknown made his heart tighten. After hours of walking, exhausted and without the strength to continue, Jacob found a place to rest. The floor was hard and cold, and all he could get as a pillow was a stone. As he lay down, he looked up at the star-studded sky and felt the deep silence of loneliness. There, in the middle of the desert, he closed his eyes, allowing fatigue to envelop him. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Jacob began to dream. Before him appeared a majestic vision, a staircase, tall and resplendent, connecting the earth to the sky. His eyes followed the steps to the top, where the divine light shone with indescribable intensity. Going up and down the ladder, angels moved with grace and purpose, as if they were carrying out important missions. It was a scene that transcended all human imagination, and Jacob could not look away. At the top of the stairs, God himself appeared. His voice echoed like soft thunder, but full of authority and comfort. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land where you are lying I will give to you and your offspring." The words filled Jacob's heart with hope. God continued, "Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth. You will spread to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south, and all the families of the earth will be blessed through you and your descendants." And as if that weren't enough, God made a promise Jacob would never forget: "I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go. I will bring you back to this earth, for I will not leave you until I fulfill all that I have promised you." When Jacob awoke, his heart was on fire. He felt a reverent awe, for he knew that he had been in the presence of the Most High. He looked around and said to himself, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it." That common place, which once seemed just a spot in the desert, was now sacred. Jacob took the stone he had used as a pillow, lifted it up like a pillar, and poured oil on it, marking that spot as special. He named the place Bethel, which means, House of God. Filled with gratitude and reverence, Jacob made a vow to the Lord: "If God is with me, protects me on this journey, gives me bread to eat and clothes to wear, and allows me to return in peace to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God." Jacob then went on his way, still with challenges ahead, but now with the certainty that he was not alone. God walked beside her, guiding every step of her journey toward the destination he had planned. Jacob in Haran. Upon arriving at Laban's house, Jacob falls in love with Rachel, Laban's youngest daughter. He agrees to work for her for 7 years, but is tricked into marrying Leah, the eldest daughter. Jacob works 7 more years to marry Rachel. Jacob finally reached Haran, after a long and weary journey. His sandals were worn, and the dust covered his feet, but he felt hope. The first stop was at a well, where shepherds gathered their flocks to drink water. There, he met a young woman of rare beauty, with eyes full of life and a smile that seemed to light up the room. She was Rachel, the daughter of Laban, the brother of her mother, Rebekah. Jacob immediately felt something special for her, as if his heart was irresistibly drawn. With gentleness and strength, Jacob rolled away the heavy stone that covered the well and watered Rachel's flock. After that, he introduced himself, saying that he was the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham. Rachel, excited, rushed to tell her father about the unexpected visitor. Laban received him with joy and hospitality, recognizing Jacob as part of the family. Life seemed to take a promising turn. Jacob began to work for Laban, tending the flocks, but his thoughts were constantly on Rachel. He knew she was the woman he wanted by his side. One day, taking courage, Jacob talked to Laban and proposed a compromise. He offered to work 7 years as payment to marry Rachel. Laban agreed, and Jacob began to fulfill his end of the bargain. The 7 years passed like the blink of an eye for Jacob, for he was motivated by love. Every morning, he dedicated himself diligently, thinking about the day when Rachel would be his wife. Finally, the moment has come. Jacob was overjoyed, and Laban organized a great wedding feast, filled with music, dancing, and laughter. But as night fell, something unexpected happened. During the most crucial moment, Laban exchanged sisters. Instead of Rachel, he gave Leah, his eldest daughter, to Jacob. The marriage was consummated without Jacob realizing the deception. When morning came and daylight revealed the truth, Jacob was shocked and confronted Laban. "What have you done to me? Didn't I work 7 years for Rachel? Why did you fool me?" Laban, with a calculated justification, replied, "Here in our land, it is not customary to give the younger daughter in marriage before the oldest. Complete the wedding week with Leah, and then I'll give you Rachel too, but you'll need to work 7 more years for her." Though hurt and frustrated, Jacob agreed. He loved Rachel deeply and was willing to endure another 7 years of hard work to have her as a wife. Thus, after completing the wedding week with Leah, Rachel also became his wife, and Jacob began to fulfill the additional years of labor. Living together in Haran, however, would not be peaceful. Jacob's heart was torn between love for Rachel and obligations to Leah, creating tensions within the family. Still, he remained steadfast, as he trusted that God was guiding every step of his journey, even in the midst of trials and challenges. Jacob's prosperity. The years in Haran passed, and Jacob's life changed profoundly. Despite the challenges and intrigues, he thrived in Laban's house. God was with Jacob, fulfilling the promises made at Bethel, and he was growing in wealth, influence, and family. Jacob, now the father of many children, was surrounded by his wives, Leah and Rachel, and his maidservants, Zilpah and Bilhah, who also bore him children. Every child that was born was a sign of God's blessing, and he saw his family multiply, as God had promised. Each child brought with him a special story, a name loaded with meaning. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and the other boys grew up among the flocks and the fields, while Jacob led his household with wisdom and determination. But it wasn't just his family that grew up. Jacob's flocks became vast. Laban, realizing that God blessed Jacob in all that he touched, made new arrangements to keep him working for him. However, with cunning and divine direction, Jacob was able to accumulate wealth. He used ingenious methods to make the best animals in the herd his property. Under the watchful eyes of Laban, who often tried to deceive him, Jacob prospered, becoming the owner of countless sheep, goats, camels, and oxen. However, as Jacob's prosperity grew, tensions in Laban's household increased. Laban's sons began to murmur, saying, "Jacob took all that was our father's and became rich at his expense." These words reached Jacob's ears, and he realized that Laban's behavior had also changed. The welcoming smile of other times gave way to suspicious looks and cold words. Jacob knew it was time to leave. On a quiet night, while looking up at the starry heavens, Jacob heard the voice of God, "Go back to the land of your fathers, to your relatives. I will be with you." With this divine guidance, Jacob made a courageous decision. He gathered his wives together and explained the situation. "You know how hard I worked for your father and how he cheated on me countless times, changing my salary several times. But God did not allow him to harm me. The Lord saw my affliction and the work of my hands. Now he has sent me back to my own land." Leah and Rachel, aware of their father's attitudes and trusting in Jacob's leadership, agreed. And so, in the dead of night, Jacob prepared his departure. He gathered his flocks, servants, and all his family, leaving behind the land of Laban. Although Jacob knew that the journey would be long and full of uncertainty, he trusted in God's promise. Laban, on discovering the departure, would not be silent. But Jacob, strengthened by divine blessing, was determined to return to the land of Canaan, where God had promised to bless him and make him a great nation. With each step, Jacob advanced towards the fulfillment of his destiny, taking with him not only material riches, but also the certainty that God was by his side, guiding him at all times. The encounter with God. After leaving Laban's home, Jacob knew that the journey back to his homeland would not be easy. His thoughts were consumed with anxiety, and a deep fear took hold of his heart. He knew that when he returned, he would have to face Esau, his brother, the one whom he had deceived years ago. Esau, with whom he had a relationship marked by betrayal and mistrust, now posed a threat. Jacob feared that his brother was still furious and wanted revenge, especially after all that had happened between them. Memories of the past came back like shadows in his mind, and Jacob felt a growing weight on his shoulders. However, he knew he couldn't run away from his fate. He had to meet with Esau, whatever the cost. But the fear was great, and so Jacob made a decision. He knelt down and said a fervent prayer to the Lord. "Lord, God of my father Abraham and my father Isaac, you have said, 'Go back to your country and to your relatives, and I will do you good.' I am unworthy of all the mercies and all the faithfulness you have shown me. For with the staff in my hand I crossed this Jordan, and now I am two sides. Deliver me out of the hand of my brother Esau, for I fear that he will come and screw me, both me and my wives and children. But you have promised that you will do good to me, and make my descendants like the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered." With his sincere prayer, Jacob sought God's mercy, acknowledging his weakness and, at the same time, his trust in the promises made to him. After praying, he took practical action. Jacob knew that a gift could help soften Esau's heart, so he sent a large number of animals at the head of his entourage: 200 goats, 200 sheep, 20 rams, 30 camels with their young, 40 cows and 10 bullocks, 20 donkeys and 10 colts. He sent them in various divisions, with messengers at the front, explaining that these animals were gifts for his brother, an offering of peace and repentance, in the hope that Esau would accept the gesture of goodwill. That night, near the Jabbok Valley, something extraordinary happened. Jacob, tired from the journey and not knowing what the future held for him, found himself alone by the river. It was at that moment that he had a supernatural encounter. A mysterious man appeared and began to fight him. The fight lasted all night, and Jacob, determined, did not give in, even though he was physically challenged. The man Jacob wrestled with was no ordinary man. It was a divine manifestation, an angel of God, or a representation of the Lord himself, but Jacob did not know it at the time. He fought with all his might, and though he was at a disadvantage, his resolve was unwavering. He knew that somehow this encounter had a deep meaning, and he didn't want to give up without an answer. Jacob kept fighting, clinging to the mysterious being with all his might, until, at dawn, the man touched Jacob's thigh and dislocated it. Even with the excruciating pain in his leg, Jacob refused to let go of his visitor. He cried out fervently, "I will not let you go without blessing me." The man, recognizing Jacob's faith and perseverance, asked him, "What is your name?" Jacob replied, still clinging tightly, "Jacob." Then the man declared, "You will no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have fought with God and with men, and you have prevailed." This moment was a watershed moment for Jacob. The struggle was not only physical, but spiritual. He had fought not only against a divine being, but against his own fears, guilt, and insecurities. By being blessed and given the new name of Israel, Jacob came to symbolize the constant struggle and perseverance of God's people, who, despite the difficulties, would prevail. The new name was not just a change of identity, but a reaffirmation of his faith and God's promise that he would be the father of a great nation. At dawn, Jacob, now Israel, with a calmer heart, looked at the mysterious man, who was already leaving, and asked him, "Tell me, what is your name?" But the man answered, "Why do you ask for my name?" And he blessed him and left him there. Jacob, now with a new perspective and a new strength, began to live from that day with the certainty that, despite his fears and mistakes, God was with him. And when he remembered what had happened that night, he called the place Peniel, saying, "I saw God face to face, and my life was spared." This encounter with God marked Jacob forever. He was no longer the man who shirked his responsibilities and feared the future. He had become Israel, the man who wrestled with God and men and prevailed. The next morning, Jacob continued his journey, now strengthened by the divine blessing, ready to face the reunion with his brother Esau. The reunion with Esau. After Jacob's transformative encounter with God, where he struggled and was blessed, he was now approaching the most tense moment of his journey, the reunion with his brother Esau. For years, fear and guilt for having deceived Esau had consumed him. He knew that when he returned to his homeland, he would have to face the consequences of his past. Jacob's last memory of Esau was his brother's anger and desire for revenge, who had threatened him with death. As a result, the fear that this threat was real accompanied him. As Jacob approached the place where he knew Esau was, he couldn't help but feel vulnerable. He had taken every possible precaution, sending gifts ahead, hoping that it would soften his brother's heart. Now, there was nothing else he could do but wait and trust in God. And so, at the dawn of a new day, Jacob looked up and saw an unexpected scene. In the distance, he saw Esau coming, and at his side 400 men of war. Jacob's heart raced. 400 men? It was an army, a number that could only mean a confrontation. The sight of his brother, surrounded by soldiers, made Jacob feel the tension rise in his chest. But though his fear was great, he knew he could run away no more. He was there before Esau, and what happened next would depend on God and his willingness to be humble. Jacob did what no proud man could easily do. He prostrated himself several times before his brother, in a gesture of deep repentance and respect. He did it not once, but several, lowering himself to the ground, with his face touching the earth, as a sign that he humbled himself before Esau, acknowledging the mistake he had made in deceiving him in the past. The scene was touching, for Jacob was not only asking for forgiveness, he was breaking the pride that had been a hallmark of his life up to that point. When Jacob made this gesture of humility, silence hung for an instant, as if time had stopped. Esau, who had watched his brother prostrate himself repeatedly, began to approach, but to Jacob's surprise, there was no anger or vengeance in his gaze. On the contrary, Esau's eyes were filled with something Jacob didn't expect, compassion and pain. Esau ran to Jacob, and when the two finally met, he embraced him tightly, with an embrace that expressed not only forgiveness but also reconciliation. Tears began to fall from the eyes of Esau, a man who had been scarred by the pain of the past, but who now found freedom in forgiveness. He wept with joy, not anger, and this act of forgiveness was more powerful than any words that could be spoken. Jacob, surprised, felt the weight of his guilt dissolve with that gesture. He, who had feared the worst, now experienced the best, the grace of forgiveness. They embraced each other for a long time, and Jacob, in the midst of this gesture of reconciliation, could not help but say, "I saw your face as if I saw the face of God, because you received me with so much love." Esau, still embracing Jacob, replied with a humility that touched his brother's heart deeply, "I have forgiven you, brother, and there is no more anger in me. What matters now is that we are together again, and that peace reigns between us." This reunion was not just a reunion between two brothers, but a time of healing and restoration. It was as if, in that embrace, they had both left behind not only the conflict of their history, but also the years of pain and mistrust that had separated them. What Jacob feared would be a meeting of vengeance and confrontation turned into a meeting of forgiveness and grace. Esau looked at the gifts Jacob had sent him and said, "I have everything I need, brother. Keep what's yours." But Jacob insisted, saying, "No, please accept it. It's a way to show my gratitude and regret." Esau, touched by Jacob's gesture, finally accepted. And so, the two brothers, now reconciled, were able to go on together with their families and assets. What began as a potential confrontation turned into a journey of peace and restoration, and the relationship between Jacob and Esau, which had long been marked by discord, was now marked by the grace of forgiveness. This reunion between Jacob and Esau is a powerful example of how, even in the most difficult situations, forgiveness and humility can transform hearts and restore relationships. The lesson that this episode leaves us with is that, no matter how painful the past has been, the opportunity to start over and to seek reconciliation is never too late, especially when one acts with humility and sincerity. The settlement in Canaan. after being reunited with his brother Esau and the reconciliation that brought peace to his heart, Jacob now continued on his journey, determined to fulfill the plans God had for him. God's promise to bless him and multiply his offspring was beginning to be fulfilled, but Jacob knew that there was still much to do. With his family and wealth acquired over the years, he was now on his way to the promised land, Canaan. Upon arriving in Shechem, a city in the mountainous region of Canaan, Jacob saw an opportunity to settle down and put down roots. Shechem was an important city, located between empty Gerizim and Ebal, and had symbolic significance to Israel's history, but still, the territory was far from being a fully peaceful land. Jacob, with his sons and wives, sought a safe place where he could live in peace and prosperity. He then decided to buy a piece of land in Shechem, a place where he could build a house and settle his family. The land, purchased from the sons of Hamor, the Hivite of Shechem, would be the basis of a new beginning for Jacob, a place where he could raise his children, worship God, and live up to the promise he had received. But it would not be just another simple change of residence. What happened there, on that piece of land, had a much deeper meaning. It was a way for Jacob to not only start a new life, but to publicly affirm his faith and trust in God. He knew that the Lord had guided him up to that moment and would guide him into the future. He also knew that a commitment to God on his journey was essential for the promised blessings to be fulfilled. Thus, after the purchase of the land, Jacob built an altar to the Lord, exactly on the spot where he had settled. This altar was not just a physical construction, it represented a declaration of faith, a way of honoring God and acknowledging that he had been faithful at every stage of his life. Jacob, who had once deceived his brother and faced many difficulties, was now a man transformed by the experience of God, and he wanted this place to be a symbol of consecration. The altar that Jacob built at Shechem was called El Elohe-Israel, which means, God, the God of Israel. By giving this name, Jacob was affirming that God was, in fact, his God, and that he would be the center of his life and his family. The altar was a constant reminder that he had been chosen by God for a great mission, and now he was willing to fulfill that mission with his entire family. The act of building the altar also had a very deep meaning. In those times, people built altars as sacred places where they could approach God. There, Jacob gave himself to the Lord, expressing his gratitude for the blessings he had received and asking for his guidance for the future. He knew that life in Canaan would not be easy, that there would still be challenges ahead, but by building that altar, he demonstrated his confidence that God would always be with him, guiding his steps. This gesture of faith was also a testimony to his family and to all who passed through Shechem. It was a sign that Jacob was not only seeking to prosper in Canaan, but that he desired to live according to God's principles, keeping his promises and keeping the covenant that had been made with his ancestors, Abraham and Isaac. The altar was a landmark not only for Jacob, but for all the generations that would come after him. There, he wanted his children to grow up with the certainty that God was with them, just as he was with their parents. Jacob's story in Canaan, especially his decision to build an altar to the Lord, teaches us about the importance of dedicating our lives to God, acknowledging his faithfulness, and seeking his guidance. Just as Jacob did in Shechem, we must also seek moments to consecrate our own hearts and our own spaces to God, allowing him to be the foundation of everything we do. Even in times of achievement and prosperity, as was the case with Jacob, it is essential that we continue to put our trust in God, recognizing that all blessings come from him. Jacob did not know exactly what the future held for him, but in building that altar, he was stepping out in faith, establishing a legacy of faith for his family. The altar at Shechem would become an enduring symbol that God is faithful and that he will always be there, guiding his children on life's journey. And so, with his family gathered around him, Jacob began to live in Canaan, with the promise that, through his descendants, God would bring blessings to all the nations of the earth. The violence in Shechem. The life of Jacob and his family in Canaan, in the city of Shechem, seemed to be stabilizing. He had bought a piece of land and dedicated the place to God, establishing an altar there as a sign of faith and commitment. But as is often the case, when peace seems within reach, unexpected challenges arise to test everyone's patience and morale. It was in Shechem that something very painful happened, something that shook Jacob's family in a deep and irreparable way. Dinah, her only daughter with Leah, was growing up and, like every young woman, dreamed of the future, of the life she could build. She was in a city that, until then, seemed to be relatively peaceful. However, what happened in Shechem would change everything. Shechem, the son of the city's leader, also named Shechem, fell in love with Dinah. But unlike a true and respectful love, Shechem's feeling for Dinah was dominated by violence and selfish desire. He dishonored her, that is, he violated her, taking her by force. What was supposed to be an exchange of respect and trust between the young people, turned into an act of brutality. That left Dinah scarred forever. She, unable to defend herself, saw her honor stolen and the pain of being disrespected invade her heart. When Shechem realized the extent of his transgression, he tried in a wrong way to remedy what he had done. He fell in love with Dinah and asked his father, Hamor, to help him make her his wife, as if that could simply erase the gravity of what had happened. Shechem's request came not with the weight of pain he had caused, but with the presumption that his own will and desire could make everything right. When Jacob learned what had happened to his daughter, he was deeply shaken. Dinah's suffering and the shame she felt spread throughout the family. Jacob, upon hearing Shechem's proposal of marriage, did not hurry to make a decision. He knew that what Shechem had done was unforgivable and that no simple promise of marriage could restore his daughter's honor. He kept quiet, waiting for the return of his children, who were away, tending to his flock. But it was the reaction of his sons, Simeon and Levi, that brought an unexpected virulence to the situation. They, driven by indignation and the desire for revenge, planned a brutal action. They would not accept that their sister's honor was tarnished without an adequate response. Thus, when they returned from their tasks, they learned what had happened and, together, they plotted a way to take justice into their own hands. Simeon and Levi, with anger, deceived Shechem and his father Hamor. They said they would accept the marriage proposal, but on one condition: all the males in the city of Shechem needed to be circumcised, as a sign that they were willing to join the people of Israel. At that moment, it seemed like a reasonable demand for Shechem and Hamor, and they accepted it without question, believing that it would resolve the conflict. The men of the city, therefore, were circumcised, but this condition was only a trick of Jacob's sons. While Shechem's men were recovering from the painful procedure, Simeon and Levi attacked the city. They entered with a relentless fury, killing all the men who were still weakened by the pain of circumcision. Jacob's sons, with their sharp swords, not only avenged their sister's honor, but they also plundered the city, taking everything that was valuable: livestock, riches, women, and children. It was a massacre, and Shechem, the ruler of the city, and his son, were killed without mercy. Jacob, upon learning of the slaughter, was deeply concerned. He feared that the revenge taken by Simeon and Levi would bring serious consequences, putting his entire family in danger before the surrounding peoples. He knew that the other cities might now see his family as a threat and would seek revenge. The violation of God's law, which demanded justice rather than personal vengeance, weighed an even greater burden on Jacob's conscience. Despite the violent action of her children, Dinah's tragedy could not be erased, and the suffering she and her family experienced would always be a reminder of the fragility of life and the need to seek peace, even when the pain seems impossible to heal. This episode in Shechem teaches us several lessons, both about the importance of justice and about the danger of allowing anger and revenge to take the place of wisdom and forgiveness. Although Simeon and Levi's action was motivated by protection and love for their sister, it also had serious consequences, reminding us that violence often only begets more violence and that true peace is won with wisdom, not anger. The story of Dinah, Shechem, and Jacob's sons in Shechem is a reminder of the complexity of life and the choices we have to make in times of pain and injustice. Returning to Bethel. After the violent episode in Shechem, Jacob's life and his family took a tense turn full of challenges. The massacre of Shechem's men and the plundering of the city had left a trail of consequences. Jacob feared that the other nations around him would turn against him, and his family was marked by the weight of that vengeance. It was in this moment of anguish and reflection that God appeared to Jacob, offering him clear direction and an opportunity for renewal. God commanded Jacob to return to Bethel, the place where he had had that extraordinary dream of the ladder that connected earth to heaven, and where he had promised to bless him and multiply his offspring. This was a direct call for Jacob to return to the roots of his faith, to remember the promises made by God and to renew his commitment to him. Bethel, which meant house of God, was the place where Jacob had experienced a profound spiritual revelation, and now God invited him to return, so that he could renew his promises. Jacob, obeying God's voice, made an important decision. He knew that in order to return to Bethel, his home needed purification. Jacob's house, like any house, was not just made up of people, but of habits, attitudes, and practices that might have strayed from God's way. He knew that he could not take with him the residues of violence, injustice, and idolatry that had crept into his home, especially after the events in Shechem. Then Jacob called his family, firmly and wisely, and commanded them to purify themselves. He knew that in order to experience spiritual renewal, a new beginning, an inner transformation, was necessary. Jacob asked everyone in his house to get rid of any idol or symbol of false deities that were present among them. These idols, which were worshipped by some of Jacob's wives and children, were to be removed. He also asked them to purify themselves through cleansing rituals, such as washing their clothes and consecrating themselves to the Lord, so that they would be ready for the new covenant with God. In addition, Jacob led his family in a moment of surrender and dedication. He knew that it was not enough just to get rid of idols and outside influences, but that above all, a pure heart consecrated to God was needed. So, he consecrated his family to the Lord, reaffirming the covenant that God had made with him. He knew that true cleansing came from obedience to God, and that the dedication of his house to the Lord would be the path to restoration and blessing. With the cleansing of his house and his family, Jacob led them to Bethel, the house of God. The road there was not easy, it was a long journey full of challenges. But Jacob knew that it was necessary to fulfill God's calling. When they arrived at Bethel, Jacob built an altar in the same place where he had had that profound spiritual experience years before, where God had spoken to him in a dream about the great promises he had for his life and his offspring. There, Jacob renewed his covenant with God and, with a heart full of gratitude and reverence, offered a sacrifice to God as a sign of his faithfulness and devotion. God, who always keeps his promises, has again manifested himself to Jacob. He reaffirmed the promises he had made earlier and gave Jacob a new name. Now, he would no longer be just Jacob, the deceiver, but Israel, the prince of God. God made a renewal of his covenant, ensuring that Jacob's descendants would be numerous, like the stars of the sky and the sand by the seashore. This promise of blessing was not only for him, but for all his people, who would be a great nation. Jacob's visit to Bethel was more than a physical return to a place, it was a spiritual return. He renewed his commitment to God, purified his house, and restored the covenant God had made with his ancestors, Abraham and Isaac. The altar that Jacob built was a symbol of his obedience and his gratitude for God's promises. Bethel became, once again, the site of a sacred encounter, where Jacob experienced God's presence in a profound and transformative way. This time at Bethel was an important lesson for Jacob and his family. Obedience to God, inner cleansing, and consecration to Him are the ways to renew faith and experience His blessings. Jacob's journey, with its difficulties and victories, continues to teach us that even in the midst of life's tribulations, God is always ready to renew us, forgive us, and lead us back to His purpose. Rachel's death. The journey of Jacob and his family was long and difficult. They had left Bethel and were now heading along the road toward Ephrathah, a town near Bethlehem. Along the way, something would happen that would forever change the course of Jacob's and his family's lives. Rachel, his beloved wife, was pregnant, and finally, the long-awaited moment of giving birth arrived. Rachel, the woman he loved deeply, was about to give birth to his second child. She had already suffered a lot in her life. From the beginning of her marriage to Jacob, she had faced the sorrow of infertility, while her sister Leah had children, one after another. God, however, finally heard his prayers and gave him Joseph, the son he so desired. Now, Rachel was pregnant again, and this time it would be a boy. To Jacob, the birth of this son was another promise fulfilled, and he hoped that with the birth of Benjamin, his happiness would be complete. But fate, however, had other plans. During childbirth, Rachel had complications. The pain was intense, and she knew something was wrong. Even with Jacob's presence at his side, death was approaching. As she struggled to give birth, Rachel, with the strength she had left, named her son Benjamin, which means, son of my grief. She knew she couldn't survive the birth, and with her last energy, she said goodbye to her son, knowing that he would bring back memories of her pain, but also of her hope. With the birth of Benjamin, Rachel passed away. Sadness gripped Jacob, who now faced the loss of his wife, the woman he loved, and also the pain of not being able to prevent her death. But as Jacob looked at his newborn son, he caught a glimpse of comfort. Benjamin was the eternal memory of Rachel, the son she left behind. Wasting no time, Jacob, his heart heavy with pain, did what was necessary to give his wife a dignified farewell. He couldn't help but pay one last tribute to the woman who has always been so important in his life. Jacob, with a heavy heart, buried Rachel and buried her along the road near Ephrathah, which would later be known as Bethlehem. In the place where she was buried, he erected a monument so that her memory would never be forgotten. This monument was not only a mark of lament but also a symbol of the greatness of Jacob's love for Rachel. He wanted everyone who passed by to know how much she meant to him. Even in the midst of grief, he knew that Benjamin carried within him the memory of Rachel, and that his memory would continue to live on through his son. This act of erecting a monument was not only a way to honor Rachel, but also a way to honor the struggle and love of a woman who, even in her grief, brought forth a son who would continue the story of Jacob and his family. And so, on the road between Bethel and Bethlehem, Rachel's name remained alive, not only in Jacob's memory but also in Israel's history. Although the sorrow of his death marked Jacob's heart, the life of Benjamin, the son of sorrow, would be a constant reminder that even in the darkest hours, hope and life continue to be born. Jacob and his family moved on, but the mourning over the loss of Rachel never left him. Still, he knew that life would go on, and that Benjamin, as the years passed, would play an important role in the great history of the people of Israel. But at that moment, the pain of loss was great, and the longing for Rachel would remain with Jacob throughout her life. The legacy of Esau and Jacob. After the reunion between Jacob and Esau, each followed a different path, and their destinies began to reflect the blessings and promises that God had for their lives. Esau, the older brother, had been forgiven by Jacob, but he knew that his future was no longer among the blessings of the birthright. He accepted his part in the unfolding of history, and his journey led him to settle in Edom, a land in southern Israel rich in mountains and precious stones. Esau began to build his own family, and over the years, he became the father of a great nation. The land of Edom, which would later be known as a strong, independent kingdom, was formed under Esau's leadership. Although he had not inherited God's promises to Abraham, yet his offspring multiplied. Esau saw his sons become princes and rulers, settling in strong cities and growing in influence. He was respected as a leader in his own land, and over time, the Edomites became known as a distinct people, with their own laws and traditions. Esau, therefore, was not a forgotten man, he was the central figure of Edom's legacy. Meanwhile, Jacob, now renamed Israel, followed a very different path. After the difficult years he spent serving Laban and facing the challenges of his own journey, he finally settled in Canaan, the land promised by God to his grandfather Abraham. Jacob, with his 12 wives and children, became the patriarch of a large family, and that family would expand to form the 12 tribes of Israel. God had given Jacob a special promise, which was not only about his personal prosperity but also about the future of God's people. He would be the father of the 12 tribes, and those tribes would become one nation. Jacob, now Israel, saw this promise fulfilled as he saw his sons multiply, each representing a tribe that would later inherit the promised land. Each of his sons would eventually be responsible for a portion of the territory of Canaan, and his offspring would become God's chosen people. The greatest example of this came through Joseph, the son Jacob had with Rachel, who would become a central figure in the history of the people of Israel. Joseph, with his vision and faith in God, would play a crucial role in saving the people during the time of famine in Egypt. But before that, Jacob would experience the weight and responsibility of being the patriarch of a chosen nation, guided by the promises God had made to his forefathers. Thus, over the years, the families of Esau and Jacob grew to become two distinct nations, both with powerful histories and enduring legacies. Esau, as the father of Edom, and Jacob, as the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, would live lives that would impact the generations that would come after them. Although the paths of both brothers were different, both were honored and remembered, each with their own role within the divine plan. Jacob, with the name of Israel, became the symbol of a nation with a divinely mapped destiny. The tribes that sprang from his sons not only formed a great nation, but they were also called to fulfill the mission of being a people set apart unto God, a people who would follow his laws and keep his word. Meanwhile, Esau and his descendants, the Edomites, prospered and became a strong people, but their lives were in a different direction. They had their own stories and legacies, but they were not the people chosen by God to fulfill the covenant that had been made with Abraham, Isaac, and Israel. Thus, the legacy of Esau and Jacob continued to unfold over the centuries. The tribes of Israel, descendants of Jacob, would later be led by figures such as Moses and David, and would be the ones who would receive the promises of the Messiah, who, according to the prophecies, would come to save the world. The Edomites, descendants of Esau, continued to exist for many generations, but their stories, although important, would remain in a secondary plane in the great theater of redemptive history. And despite the different paths they took, the story of Jacob and Esau is a reminder of how God's grace can manifest itself in different ways, whether in forgiveness and reconciliation or in fulfillment of promises and legacies. The lives of these two brothers, separated by past choices, show that despite difficulties and differences, God's plan for humanity continues to be carried out, in ways that are often surprising. Conclusion. And so, we come to the end of this fascinating journey in the lives of Jacob and Esau. We have seen how, despite the difficulties, choices, and separations, both have played important roles in God's plans. Jacob, like Israel, became the father of the 12 tribes that would form the chosen people, while Esau, with his own lineage, founded a strong and prosperous nation. Both paths teach us valuable lessons about forgiveness, legacy, and God's sovereignty over our lives. Now, stay tuned, because as we move forward, we will see how these legacies of Jacob and Esau continue to impact God's history and promises. What would happen next to the tribes of Israel? And how does the story of Esau and his descendants fit into God's great plan?